Welcome back everyone to another Downward Day. And here on the channel I've spent a lot of time so far talking about disappointing media. But today, we're going to be talking about a recent release that did not disappoint. That's right, on this edition of the Downward Diary, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on Smiling Friends. And I understand that I'm pretty late to the party when it comes to discussing this show, but there's a reason for that which I'm going to get into later. So first and foremost, I just wanted to say that I've been impressed by Smiling Friends so far. I think the creators are putting out a good product, and it's been exciting to see the show rise to such success. The show feels very modern while also retaining a lot of the old-fashioned vibes that you can find in a lot of the classic Adult Swim cartoons. The episodes are tightly written, there's a lot of consistently funny jokes, and the stories feature a ton of variety. The art direction is visually interesting. The show incorporates a lot of mixed media and a bunch of different animation styles, with almost each individual episode featuring something visually unique. The style of humor in the show is also pretty fresh. A lot of the jokes are really understated. There's a lot of attention to detail in the dialogue to give it mostly this casual, laid-back tone. There's a lot of dark humor too, which I also think is handled pretty well. It never really feels like the show is trying too hard to be edgy or perverted, which is unfortunately a trap that a lot of other adult animated series tend to fall into. And while we're at it, can I just say how refreshing it is to finally have a show from millennial-age people that doesn't sound like it came fresh out of the Tumblr school of writing. This type of thing is becoming much more of a rare sight nowadays, so I definitely appreciate it when I see it. I guess I take a lot of personal satisfaction in watching a show like this succeed. And that's because I've been watching these guys like Oni and Psychic Pebbles ever since I was a little kid. Like I remember Hellbenders, I was there for their first attempt that failed to actually get on the air. So it's been gratifying after all this time to finally see these guys break through to the next level and be successful. It's encouraging to see these independent online creators cut their teeth for so many years and finally break into the industry. And they managed to do so without having to sell out or compromise what made their content so special and interesting in the first place. Smiling Friends really does feel faithful to that old-fashioned style of Newgrounds humor that I loved so much as a kid. And it's been very cool to see the creators of the show basically carry the flag of Newgrounds into mainstream entertainment. You know, the people who grew up on Tumblr have already had plenty of shows to enjoy at this point. It feels nice to finally have something appeal to us Newgrounds kids for a change. And it makes me happy to see the style of humor I enjoyed as a kid go on to entertain a new generation. So Smiling Friends is undoubtedly a popular show at this point. It's developed a pretty big following online, and actually as I've been recording this, the show's been renewed for several more seasons with Season 3 releasing later this year. Thus far, it seems like all the building blocks are in place for a promising new series to continue succeeding into the future. And I'd probably be more excited about it if I didn't have this nagging suspicion in the back of my head that I've already traveled down this road before. Because when I look at Smiling Friends, I can't help but be reminded of a distant echo from the past, where there's this popular and exciting new Adult Swim show from two emerging creators that thus far has produced 2 seasons of great television and can seemingly do no wrong. Now wait just a darn minute here. I've played this game before. That's right everyone, it's time once again to visit the ghost of wasted potential past. And that's Rick and Morty, a series that in the beginning had a pretty similar trajectory to what Smiling Friends has now. It was a show that had caught lightning in a bottle, had red-hot momentum going forward, and then for a variety of convoluted circumstances, it just lost all of its mojo. For about a 3-year span, Rick and Morty was this almost inescapable titan of pop culture. It was everywhere. It had this huge fan base, and then slowly but surely it just quietly fizzled out. Over the years, they just kept chugging along, putting out new episodes, and people just more or less stopped caring. And while many may chalk up this decline to the overall transience of popular trends, I think you'd be hard-pressed to deny that the show's popularity wasn't mishandled, at least a little bit, and that there's an alternate timeline where Rick and Morty is much more popular today than it currently is in reality. So what exactly was the problem? How did the show that everyone loved pretty much lose all of its aura? Well, it turns out that this was a question I attempted to answer 5 years ago in a main channel video. At the time I released it, Rick and Morty was in its 4th season and showing clear signs of decline from its peak just a few years earlier. So if you want to hear my full thought process on why Rick and Morty declined, I suggest you revisit that video. But if I had to boil the whole thing down to one main idea, to put it in the words of esteemed film critic Peter Griffin, the show got to a point where it started to insist upon itself.
It insists upon itself, Lois.
And more specifically, insist on this idea that Rick and Morty is a show designed for smart people. All of a sudden, the series found itself having to live up to this moniker of the smartest show on television, starring the smartest man in the universe. It was no longer enough for the show to simply do its own thing, and to operate in its own unique way. All of a sudden, the show had to present itself with this air of intellectualism. It had to adhere to this label that was placed on it by the audience. And so now, instead of sticking to the established artistic vision that they had in mind, the show was haphazardly injected with what essentially amounted to a bunch of fan service that devalued the overall product. They took the main protagonist of the show, Rick, a character who was initially portrayed with a great deal of depth, and they turned him into this one-dimensional ass-kicking superhero. He very abruptly stopped being the flawed scientist with commitment issues and insecurities, and instead turned into sort of this self-insert avatar for the audience to live out their power fantasies. This is also the time when you start to see the infamous high IQ copy pasta being spread around. And while I'm almost entirely convinced that the original post was a joke, it did accurately portray a very real sentiment around the show. And that was this idea that Rick and Morty viewers saw themselves as smarter than everyone else. And so this weird dynamic that had formed started to make it such that the act of enjoying the show had become this uncomfortable and unpleasant experience, where now you can't just watch the show because you think it's cool or funny. No, you have to watch it because it's smart and because you're smart. And eventually it got to the point where when you brought up to other people that you watched the show, the reaction started to become, "Oh wow, you must be so smart," or "Oh wow, you must think you're smarter than everyone else." And I'd have to sit there and defend myself like, no, I only watch it because I think it's neat. It doesn't have anything to do with this perception of being more intelligent than others. But over the years, this fear of getting labeled as this pretentious, arrogant pseudo-intellectual for admitting that you like Rick and Morty essentially forced me into the closet over liking the show. It became something that I felt uncomfortable admitting to other people. And of course, this is just my personal experience, but I suspect that many of you out there can probably relate. So what exactly does all of this have to do with the Smiling Friends? Well, when you look back historically at how the perception of something like Rick and Morty started to change, I've been a little bit concerned lately that the same thing is starting to happen to Smiling Friends. I'm starting to see people on Twitter extolling the show for its genius political commentary. There's this group of people out there who are trying to reclassify Smiling Friends as an intellectual show. And after personally witnessing what happened to Rick and Morty, my immediate response to all of this is, can you guys just knock it off? We already have ourselves a good and entertaining product. Can we stop trying to twist it into something that it's not? And before I go further into this idea, it's important that you don't misconstrue what I'm trying to say here. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't appreciate smart design in a show. I think it's important to celebrate whenever a show does something particularly ingenious or clever. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't use shows as a prop to validate our own personal sense of intelligence. You shouldn't tune into something because the act of doing so makes you feel smarter compared to other people. In my opinion, that's just a really cynical way of approaching media, and it only serves to devalue the creative identity of whatever you're watching. I don't exactly know where this idea started that a show has to appeal to smart people in order to validate its own existence. But it seems like this way of thinking has been growing ever since the beginning of the internet, when people first got the ability to talk about movies and TV in a decentralized forum. Ever since then, there has risen this sort of online intelligentsia who really want to feel superior based on the media they consume. And for a while, their presence really wasn't that much of a problem back when Hollywood and the entertainment industry were doing their own thing. But in recent times, this type of person has become so pervasive that they're actually starting to affect the content that everyone gets to consume. So when you take something that's supposed to be simple and straightforward and then inject a bunch of unnecessary intellectualism into it, it more often than not ends up ruining the product. And to give you another example, I will attribute this exact line of thinking to why DC spent the entire previous decade struggling to put out a single good film. They saw the success of the Dark Knight trilogy, these group of films that everyone just filleted as finally being a comic book story for smart people, and they decided to just apply that philosophy to all of their movies in a 10-year span. And for the record, I liked The Dark Knight. I think it's a great film. The Dark Knight Rises, on the other hand, is total garbage, but that's a conversation for another time. And there ended up being far worse consequences of DC's bright idea to start making superheroes into this intellectual statement. Oh, and speaking of which, here's another great idea. Why don't we take Superman and make him dark and brooding, and have an entire series of films centered around his contempt for humanity? Oh, and while we're at it, why don't we just start serving people a peanut butter and diarrhea sandwich? Think about how clever and subversive it'll be when they're expecting the taste of jelly and instead they get a hot mouthful of diarrhea. It's so smart and interesting, and it really makes a statement about the nature of sandwiches. And look, I'm all for studios trying to be a little more innovative and experimental. But there comes a point when your insistence on outsmarting the room ends up being counterproductive and leading to poor design choices. This misguided initiative to turn Superman into this dark and brooding enigma just like the Dark Knight ended up backfiring spectacularly, and it put the entire brand in a hole that they're still trying to dig themselves out of to this day. Look, I understand that when it comes to entertainment, you gotta be at least a little bit bright to make something successful. But part of that creative intelligence has to come with the thought process that it's far easier to succeed with something simple than something complex. It takes a lot of intelligence to produce something good and memorable. But the thing about good design is that the intelligence within is supposed to be subtle. It's not supposed to interrupt or take focus away from everything else. When it comes to film and television, I have the most respect for stuff like Beavis and Butthead, which manages to be entertaining at a variety of different audience levels. It's a show about dumb people doing dumb things, but the design is smart. And it doesn't need to remind you constantly of that. It sticks to a simple, straightforward premise and executes on it well. And when it comes to what you want out of a cartoon, there's really not much more you can ask for. Eventually you'll find that series like this tend to stand the test of time much better than other shows where the writers have to constantly flex their knowledge of rhetorical devices and obscure nerd trivia. And so, with all that said, I hope the creators of Smiling Friends can heed the warning that Rick and Morty left behind for them. And if we're lucky, you won't have to have a very high IQ to enjoy it.
Thanks for watching the Downward Diary, guys.
You don't got the Smiling Friend sauce?
Where's my Smiling Friend sauce? Where's my Smiling Friend sauce?
The fuck from my table, fuckface.
Mr. Frog, I ate the bug!